Greetings. God is within you. Precisions on the 3 stages of the mystical ascent in general, and as to ecstasy, rapture, and the living fire of love in particular. In answer to 2 questions posed on the mystical life. First, no, ecstasies and raptures do not occur in the way of the beginner, which is the infancy of the mystical life. And no, one cannot possess the living fire of love and not be aware of it. Its possession constitutes the soul's most continually intense spiritual awareness of all its life and of all its mystical experiences, including ecstasy and rapture. The living fire of love actually constitutes the soul's awareness of itself and is the only way that the soul knows that it is alive once it has entered into the higher estates of mystical union, for it has become the soul's divine self, this marvelous, this magnificent fire of love. Also, it is more properly a fire of love than a flame of love, for it is a conflagration greater than the greatest forest fire conceivable, and is like a sea of blazing fire from horizon to horizon in the soul's terrain, the blazing, burning sea of the self, of the soul, which the soul has become. The soul, in perfection, is not so much a living flame of love as it is a blazing sun of the living fire of love. Please allow me to further explain some of this by means of a little outline of the mystical life. But first of all, let me say that the mystical life as a whole is the soul's organic, spiritual, progressive growth into God, the soul's progressive, processive, developmental growth into somewhat of God, something of what God is. This is an organic growth which follows the laws of living, growing things, that is, simplistically put, no doubt, earlier stages do not possess the attributes of later stages. The seed is not the shoot is not the blossom, and the blossom is not the fruit. They all happen in one single plant, but they are specifically different stages of growth and development. Otherwise, nature is turned on its head and is incomprehensible. Now I provide you an 8-point discussion outline. 1. In the way of the beginner, the primary spiritual attribute is intellectual vision only, which constitutes the soul's pure, simple, unelaborated awareness of the presence of God. This awareness does not experience any developmental growth. It is a simple, unchanging awareness of the comforting, protecting presence of God to the soul. It constitutes the saint's lonely, friendly, kindly, sweet awareness of the Father and companion of the soul. It is an unspoken, unnameable, divine friendship that does not grow in intensity, but simply remains the same and does not change until what follows occurs. 2. The molting season of the soul arrives with God's initial sublime presentation of God's self to the soul as the soul's exalted Father and Creator, usually in some extraordinary vision, not intellectual vision, but imaginative, sublime, spiritual vision, such as that which Catherine of Siena had at about 7 years of age, when she saw Christ seated on top of a church, robed and crowned as her divine king. Her brother distracted her from the sublime vision, and when she turned back to look at it again, it had vanished, and she wept inconsolably. So extraordinary was the glory of what she had seen. So this is not intellectual vision, which has no content, but a different gift of vision that is imaginative, spiritual, and of great glory and minutely describable content. All of this is in the way of the beginner. And here there are no ecstasies and no raptures. 3. This way of the beginner infancy of the mystical life continues from the period of intellectual vision into the molting season of the soul and its one great extraordinary vision, and continues on into a new developmental process of soul purifying itself and turning ever more completely to God. We are still in the way of the beginner infant, and the saint now participates in divine services frequently, and prays all the time, and seeks God everywhere and in everything. In this condition of self-purification, the soul frequently removes itself from the world, purifies its speech and thought, allowing no curse words in its consciousness, but banishing all profanity immediately that it presents itself, thus maintaining an extraordinary purity of thought and speech, also allowing no evil thoughts regarding others, no thoughts of revenge or anything like that. The soul seeks only the thought of the good and the pure, wanting only to serve God and to be pure and worthy to be in God's presence. 4. After perhaps 2 or 3 years of this active self-purification, God begins to passively purify the soul. That is, God begins to purify the soul over and beyond the soul's ability to purify itself. That is why it is called passive purification, because the soul does not act but is rather acted upon. In this passive purification, God removes from the soul all desire for external things whatsoever, and the soul loses its taste for worldly pleasures, even legitimate ones, because God is cleansing and emptying its senses so that they may be filled with a divine presence which is about to be visited upon them in the form of ecstasy and rapture, once the soul has gone through its final deep, passive sense purification in the black night of the senses. 5. This black night of the senses comes at the end of the way of the beginner infant and inaugurates the soul into the way of the proficient, progressive adolescent of the mystical life. This is a time of intense suffering for the soul, and everyone who sees the soul takes pity on it because it is suffering so badly and is in such misery, and no one can help it at all. Only God can help it, but God has seemed to turn against the soul and to be opposed to the soul, and is now making active war upon the soul, cleansing the soul in a black acid liquid fire which pours down into the soul, causing the soul extraordinary agony and suffering in the senses and imagination, because these faculties are being actively voided by God of all their content whatsoever, which causes the soul unbelievable suffering, agony, and distress. The divine touch is experienced as heavy, searing, and relentlessly probing and merciless, while in fact the divine touch is completely sweet, gentle, and mild, but the soul experiences it as difficult and oppressive because the soul is not used to God's direct, intimate touch upon it. Later on, the soul will realize the error of its perception and will come to experience the divine touch exactly as it is, sweet, merciful, tender, and loving. 6. In the way of the proficient adolescent, ecstasy and rapture now descend upon the soul, which has passed through the brief period of passive purification of the black night of sense. The great drama of the soul's life has begun in the black night of sense, and is now continued and amplified beyond the soul's wildest dreams and imagination in the way of the proficient. For here, ecstasy and rapture begin their reign and dominance in the spiritual life of the saint. Therefore, ecstasy is the sweet, mild, delicious, intoxicating touch of God upon the soul, which causes the soul to swoon and faint away toward uplift into God. This fainting away and gentle swoon are merged into rapture, in which God takes a mighty hold upon the soul and snatches the soul away from the body to an extensive degree, such that the soul is wrapped up to God and into the place between the worlds, between earth and heaven, where God and soul meet in the passing union of love, which is ecstasy rapture. So, ecstasy rapture is proper to the way of the proficient adolescent, and is characteristic of this middle ground of the mystical life, and defines it as such, that definition being the illuminative way of the betrothed of God. For the way of the proficient progressive adolescent is properly the way of illumination of the engaged bride-to-be, since great and profound illuminations of the divinity are granted to the soul in this stage of its development by means of ecstasy rapture, and most profoundly by means of rapture properly so called. For ecstasy and rapture are, as it were, the precious and rare gifts of the soul's dowry given to it by its father and fiancé, the Godhead Triunity. 7. The black night of the spirit marks the end of the way of the proficient and inaugurates the soul into the way of the perfect adult of the mystical life. This black night of spirit is God's passive purification of the soul's higher faculties of intellect, will, and memory, during which period of perhaps a year or two in duration, the soul is purified by God of all of its concepts of God and all the things of God, and is emptied of all of its experience of God whatsoever, so that God leaves the soul void of any knowledge at all of God, or delight in God, or the things of God. It is the time of the loneliest suffering of the soul ever, for no one understands it, and neither does it understand itself. It is dead to the world, to itself, and to God, and it is sustained by sheer faith alone, since it no longer has any hope nor any love. It is a lonely thing of faith alone, for it places all of its trust in God, whom it sees no more, for ecstasy and rapture have vanished, and it is left to its own miserable, useless, helpless devices, and so, in desperation, it clings to faith alone. All the time, in the perhaps 10 years of its proficiency in the mystical life, ecstasy and raptures have been becoming less and less frequent. In their initial appearance they occurred once or twice a week, then once or twice a month, then only occasionally, then almost vanished altogether, and then the black night of spirit descends upon the soul, and the soul is plunged into boundless spiritual blackness. 8. The way of the perfect adulthood of the mystical life occurs at the end of this period of the black night of spirit, when the soul is drawn by God onto a divine oasis of peace and spiritual refreshment, which is a prelude to its actual ascent into the way of the perfect, which is the soul's spiritual marriage to God. This oasis of divine love and refreshment of the soul is a kind of peace treaty between God and the soul, and a kind of surrender of each one to the other of the warring parties. For each one lays down their arms in an act of surrender to the other. The soul may perhaps have an exalted vision of the Godhead and of itself as a fetus within the womb of God, about to be born out of God, God about to give birth to a divine thing, the soul itself, the like of which in beauty and peace the soul has never seen before. The next day or so, and the soul is perhaps taken up onto the top of the mountain of God and deposited there alone, when suddenly the soul's great lover arrives to it, and the two exchange the vows of marriage forever, each to the other. Then the great life of perfection begins for the soul in the institution of the way of the perfect within it, by the coming to it of the divine light of life, which is the living fire of love, of which I spoke above, which will inhabit the soul and descend and deepen within it until the saint's death and entrance into the heaven of the estate of the eternal glory, of the permanent, unending, beatific vision of the great holy triunity. Be forever blessed in the profound knowledge that God is within you. Please be so kind as to like, subscribe, and share. Thank you so much.